You are sitting in a room with someone who is absolutely certain. Maybe it is a family member, maybe it is a friend, maybe it is you. The conversation starts casually, then suddenly becomes serious. Someone mentions God. Within seconds, the atmosphere changes. Voices become firmer. Opinions become sharper. Defenses rise before anyone even realizes it. And that is where something strange happens. Nobody is arguing about what they know. They are arguing about what they cannot prove. Yet everyone speaks with the confidence of someone describing their own living room. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever stopped in the middle of one of those conversations and wondered why a subject surrounded by uncertainty produces so much certainty in people? Not whether God exists, not whether religion is right, not whether science has all the answers. Something deeper. Why does this topic reach places inside people that almost nothing else can touch? Why can a conversation about God make intelligent people emotional, calm people defensive, and skeptical people surprisingly passionate? Before you talk about God again, there is an uncomfortable possibility worth considering. What if the most important thing in the conversation is not God at all? What if the most important thing is what the conversation reveals about us? Think about the last time you faced something completely beyond your control, a hospital waiting room, a phone call that changed your life, the moment someone you loved walked away, the night you stared at the ceiling wondering how everything became so complicated. In those moments, something happens to the human mind. It starts searching, not necessarily for answers, for stability, for meaning, for something that makes the chaos feel less random. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the need for meaning is not limited to believers. The person who believes may search for purpose through faith. The person who rejects faith may search for purpose through reason, achievement, relationships, or personal freedom. Different paths, same hunger. The hunger itself is rarely discussed. We spend enormous amounts of time debating conclusions, while almost never examining the emotional need that drives the search. Imagine a child asking why. Why is the sky blue? Why do people die? Why does suffering exist? Why am I here? At first, those questions seem simple. Then life happens. Years pass. The questions remain. The vocabulary changes. The confidence changes. The worldview changes. But the questions survive. Somewhere inside almost every adult is the same child asking why. The difference is that adults become very skilled at hiding uncertainty. We create identities around answers. We join communities around answers. We build entire lives around answers. Then one day somebody challenges those answers, and it feels personal because it is personal. The challenge is not directed at an idea. It feels directed at the structure holding reality together. If this has ever crossed your mind, leave a comment. Not to prove a point. Not to win an argument, just honestly. Have you ever felt uncomfortable when someone questioned something you were certain about? Not because they were wrong, but because part of you feared they might expose a question you had been avoiding yourself. That feeling matters more than most people realize, because certainty often has a complicated relationship with fear. Not always, but often. Think about how people respond to uncertainty in other areas of life. Financial uncertainty creates anxiety. Relationship uncertainty creates anxiety. Health uncertainty creates anxiety. The unknown has always unsettled the human mind. Yet there may be no uncertainty larger than existence itself. Why are we here? What happens when we die? Is there a purpose behind suffering? Is consciousness an accident or something more? Whether someone answers those questions with faith, philosophy, science, or personal experience, they are still confronting the same mystery. The mystery does not disappear because a conclusion has been chosen. It simply becomes easier to live with. That realization changes the way you see people. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about who is right and who is wrong. It becomes a story about how human beings cope with the deepest unknowns imaginable. A man loses someone he loves and turns toward faith. Another loses someone he loves and turns away from faith. From the outside, their conclusions appear opposite, but beneath the surface, both are responding to the same wound, the same grief, the same confrontation with mortality, the same desperate search for understanding. And this is where many conversations about God begin to fall apart. People often debate conclusions while ignoring experiences. One person speaks from pain, another speaks from tradition, another speaks from hope, another speaks from disappointment, another speaks from fear, another speaks from gratitude, yet everyone pretends they are only discussing ideas. They are not. They are discussing experiences disguised as ideas. The person who says they believe may be carrying memories that make belief feel natural. The person who says they do not believe may be carrying experiences that make belief feel impossible. Neither life story can be reduced to a simple argument. That is why these conversations become emotionally charged so quickly. Human beings rarely defend ideas alone. They defend the experiences attached to those ideas. Consider the moments when people feel closest to certainty. Often it is not during intellectual debates, it is during emotional experiences, a near-death experience, a personal tragedy, a moment of overwhelming beauty, the birth of a child, the death of a parent, a season of loneliness so deep that survival itself feels like a victory. Those moments change people. Sometimes they strengthen faith. Sometimes they destroy it. Sometimes they create questions that remain unanswered for decades. Yet the experience itself often feels more real than any argument. That creates a difficult tension. How do you debate something rooted in personal experience? How do you convince someone that a moment which transformed their entire understanding of life was meaningless? How do you convince someone that a painful experience which shattered their worldview should be ignored? You cannot easily do either, because beneath every worldview is a human story, and stories are stubborn. They survive facts, they survive arguments, they survive criticism, they become part of identity. There is another uncomfortable layer beneath all of this. Many people secretly believe they are searching for truth when they are actually searching for reassurance. That statement should make everyone uncomfortable because it applies across worldviews. Human beings are remarkably skilled at gathering information that supports what they already want to believe. We like to imagine ourselves as objective seekers of truth. Reality is often messier. We are emotional creatures first and rational creatures second. We frequently reach conclusions emotionally and justify them intellectually afterward. That does not make people dishonest. It makes them human. The question is whether we are willing to admit it. Because the moment you admit it, something changes. The conversation becomes less about defeating opponents and more about understanding yourself. Why does a particular answer feel attractive to you? Why does a particular explanation feel threatening? Why do certain questions create discomfort? Why do some arguments make you angry before you have fully examined them? Those questions reveal something important. They reveal that discussions about God are often discussions about identity, fear, hope, mortality, meaning, belonging, and purpose, disguised as intellectual debates. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to separate the philosophical question from the psychological one. Somewhere ahead is an even more uncomfortable realization, one that has less to do with whether God exists and more to do with why human beings need certainty in the first place. But before getting there, pause and consider something simple. The next time you hear someone speak confidently about God, whether they are defending belief or rejecting it, ask yourself what experiences might exist beneath the words. Ask yourself what fears, hopes, disappointments, losses, victories, and unanswered questions helped shape that certainty. Because once you begin seeing that layer, the conversation changes forever, and what comes next may challenge assumptions on both sides in ways most people never expect. There is a moment that almost everyone experiences, but very few people talk about openly. It usually happens late at night. The distractions are gone, the notifications stop, the conversations end, the performance ends, and suddenly there is nothing between you and your own thoughts. You may have experienced it after a funeral, after a breakup, after a major failure, after an unexpected success that somehow felt emptier than you imagined. You lie there staring into the darkness, and for a few seconds a strange feeling appears. Not fear exactly, not sadness exactly, something harder to describe. It feels like standing on the edge of an enormous mystery. During the day, people are busy explaining life. At night, many quietly realize they do not understand it nearly as much as they pretend. That realization is one of the most honest moments a human being can have. Because beneath our confidence, beneath our identities, beneath our arguments and opinions, there is a reality that none of us escape. We are all trying to make sense of an existence we did not choose, inside a universe we did not create, moving toward an ending we cannot fully comprehend. Think about how strange that actually is. Human beings can build cities, develop technology, study distant galaxies, and decode the building blocks of life itself. Yet some of the biggest questions remain untouched. Why is there something instead of nothing? Why does consciousness exist at all? Why do human beings crave meaning so intensely? Why does suffering affect us the way it does? Why do we care about justice, purpose, beauty, and love? Notice that these questions are not exclusively religious or non-religious. They belong to everyone. The person sitting in a church wonders about them. The scientist studying the universe wonders about them. The philosopher wonders about them. The skeptic wonders about them. The believer wonders about them. The difference is not whether the questions exist. The difference is how people respond to them. And that response reveals something fascinating about human psychology. Many people imagine that certainty is the destination. But what if certainty is often a defense mechanism against uncertainty? Think about the people you have met who seemed absolutely certain about everything. Not just religion, politics, relationships, morality, life itself. At first, certainty appears strong, confident, stable. But sometimes if you look closely enough, you discover something unexpected. Beneath the certainty is fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing identity. Fear of discovering that reality is more complicated than expected. Fear of standing alone without answers. This is not a criticism. It is a human tendency. The mind naturally seeks stability. It wants solid ground beneath its feet. The problem is that existence often refuses to provide that ground. Life keeps presenting contradictions. Good people suffer. Cruel people sometimes prosper. Prayers appear answered in one situation and unanswered in another. Random events change entire lives. Tragedy strikes without warning. Miracles seem obvious to one person and invisible to another. The more honestly someone examines reality, the more complexity they tend to encounter. And complexity creates discomfort. This is why conversations about God often become emotional long before they become logical. Because the discussion is touching something deeper than evidence. It is touching a person's relationship with uncertainty itself. Imagine two people standing beside the same event. One sees divine intervention, the other sees coincidence. One sees purpose, the other sees randomness. The event remains identical. The interpretation changes. Now here is the uncomfortable question. How much of what we believe about reality is shaped by reality itself? And how much is shaped by our need to emotionally survive reality? Sit with that question for a moment, because it cuts deeper than most people expect. Human beings do not merely process information. They process pain, they process hope, they process fear, they process loneliness, they process mortality. And all of those emotional forces influence the way reality is interpreted. Consider the person who spent years praying through unimaginable hardship. Perhaps faith became the thing that kept them alive emotionally. To that person, belief may not feel like an abstract concept. It may feel like survival. Now consider someone else who experienced devastating disappointment connected to beliefs they once trusted completely. To that person, doubt may not feel intellectual. It may feel necessary for emotional honesty. Both individuals can be sincere. Both can be intelligent. Both can be deeply thoughtful. Yet their conclusions may move in opposite directions because they are responding not only to evidence, but to lived experience. If you have ever struggled with this tension, let me know below. Not which side you ended up on, the struggle itself. The moment when certainty became harder than it used to be. The moment when questions became impossible to ignore, because those moments reveal something profound about being human. Most people do not change because they hear a better argument. They change because they encounter an experience that makes their current framework impossible to maintain. A conversation rarely transforms someone overnight. a life experience can. This brings us to something many people overlook when talking about God. There is a difference between knowing an answer and needing an answer. That distinction changes everything. Imagine being trapped in the middle of a storm at sea. The waves are enormous. Visibility is gone. Survival feels uncertain. In that moment, the psychological need for direction becomes overwhelming. Human beings are not built merely to observe existence. We need orientation. We need a story that tells us where we are, who we are, and how we should move forward. The details of that story may vary dramatically from person to person, but the need itself appears almost universal. Perhaps that is why meaning matters so much. Not because meaning eliminates suffering, but because suffering becomes harder to bear without it. And yet, there is another layer, a dangerous layer, because the need for meaning can sometimes become stronger than the desire for truth. History is filled with examples of people embracing comforting narratives simply because they reduced anxiety. That possibility should make everyone uncomfortable. It should make believers uncomfortable. It should make skeptics uncomfortable. It should make anyone who values intellectual honesty uncomfortable, because no one is immune to self-deception. Every human mind has blind spots. Every worldview contains assumptions. Every perspective has limits. The question is whether we are willing to acknowledge them. And here is where the conversation becomes truly unsettling. What if the greatest obstacle to understanding is not ignorance? What if it is the illusion of certainty? The moment someone becomes convinced they have absolutely nothing left to learn, curiosity dies. Reflection dies. Growth dies. The conversation ends before it begins. Yet the most thoughtful people throughout history often shared a surprising characteristic. They were comfortable living with questions, not because they enjoyed confusion, because they recognized the limits of their knowledge. They understood that reality might be larger than any framework designed to explain it. That realization creates a different kind of humility, a humility that does not require abandoning convictions, a humility that simply recognizes that being human means seeing through a limited lens. And once that humility appears, conversations change. They become less about winning and more about understanding, less about proving superiority and more about exploring mystery, less about defeating opponents and more about confronting the questions that every human being eventually faces. The reason this matters becomes clearer when you examine your own life. Think about the beliefs you held 10 years ago. Some changed, some disappeared, some became stronger, some became more nuanced. What caused those changes? Usually not a single argument. Usually it was experience, suffering, growth, loss, love, failure, time. Reality itself slowly reshaping perspective, which leads to a realization that many people spend years avoiding. The conversation about God may reveal less about the universe than it reveals about the human condition, about our fears, our hopes, our longing for certainty, our resistance to uncertainty, our desperate search for meaning in a world that often feels confusing and unpredictable. And there is one final tension hiding beneath all of it, a tension that touches every person regardless of belief. Because eventually every human being reaches a point where intellectual discussion collides with personal reality, a point where the question is no longer what you think about existence. The question becomes how you live within it. That is where the deepest part of this exploration begins, and that is where the most uncomfortable realization is still waiting. Imagine two people standing at the edge of the same cliff overlooking the ocean. The wind is strong. The horizon stretches farther than the eye can see. For a moment, both become silent. One believes they are looking at the work of a creator. The other believes they are looking at the product of natural processes unfolding across unimaginable stretches of time. Their conclusions differ, yet something remarkable happens. Both feel small. Both feel wonder. Both feel the strange emotional weight that appears when a human being confronts something larger than themselves. That moment matters because it exposes a truth many arguments overlook. Long before people debate explanations, they share experiences. Long before they disagree about meaning, they encounter mystery. Long before they develop philosophies, religions, or worldviews, they stand face to face with existence itself and feel something difficult to put into words. The mistake many conversations make is assuming the deepest human experience is certainty. It may not be. It may be awe. It may be the recognition that life is simultaneously familiar and incomprehensible. You wake up every morning inside a reality that you did not create. You occupy a consciousness that you did not design. You move through years that seem endless while you are living them, and impossibly brief when you look back. You watch people enter your life and leave it. You form attachments knowing they can be broken. You build plans knowing they can collapse. You love despite the possibility of loss. You hope despite uncertainty. You continue despite not knowing how the story ends, and somehow this becomes normal. Yet if you pause long enough, the strangeness returns. The mystery returns. The realization returns that no matter how advanced humanity becomes, every individual still faces questions that cannot simply be handed to someone else. At some point, each person must confront existence directly. This is where the most uncomfortable realization begins to emerge. Before you talk about God again, before you defend a position, before you criticize a position, before you repeat an argument you have heard 100 times, ask yourself a different question. What role does this belief play in my life? Not whether it is right, not whether it is wrong. What role does it play? Because sometimes people imagine they are protecting truth when they are actually protecting identity. Sometimes they imagine they are defending logic when they are defending pride. Sometimes they imagine they are pursuing understanding when they are pursuing emotional comfort. The difficult part is that these motives often operate beneath conscious awareness. Nobody wakes up in the morning intending to deceive themselves, yet self-deception rarely announces its arrival. It hides inside certainty. It hides inside assumptions that have never been examined. It hides inside beliefs inherited so early that they feel like reality itself. This applies to everyone, every worldview, every ideology, every community, every individual. That is why genuine self-reflection is so uncomfortable. It requires the courage to investigate not only what you believe, but why you believe it. And that investigation can feel threatening because beliefs are rarely isolated ideas. They become connected to family, culture, memories, relationships, identity, and belonging. Challenging them can feel like challenging the foundations of your own life. Yet some of the most transformative moments people experience begin precisely there. Not when they discover a new answer, but when they discover a new question. A question powerful enough to break automatic thinking. A question that interrupts certainty long enough for curiosity to return. Think about the moments that changed you most. Chances are they were not moments when everything became simple. They were moments when complexity became impossible to ignore. The realization that a parent was not perfect. The realization that success does not automatically create happiness. The realization that intelligence does not protect people from mistakes. The realization that suffering can affect anyone. The realization that life is far less predictable than you once believed. Growth often begins where certainty ends. That does not mean certainty is always wrong. It means certainty should never become a substitute for reflection. Because once reflection stops, something dangerous happens. The world becomes divided into people who agree with you and people who do not. Curiosity disappears. Listening disappears. Empathy disappears. The conversation becomes a battle rather than an exploration. Yet reality rarely fits neatly into battles. Human beings are too complicated for that. Consider how many people have changed positions throughout their lives. Some moved toward faith after years of skepticism. Others moved toward skepticism after years of faith. Some remained in the same place, but developed deeper nuance and humility. What often drove those changes was not intellectual weakness. It was experience. Life continued teaching lessons that no debate could fully communicate. A person survives tragedy and sees the world differently. A person becomes a parent and sees the world differently. A person loses everything and sees the world differently. A person finds unexpected meaning and sees the world differently. Reality keeps reshaping perspective whether people want it to or not. And perhaps that is why humility matters so much. Not because humility guarantees correct conclusions, but because it keeps the door open. It allows someone to learn, to adapt, to grow. to remain curious in the presence of uncertainty. The irony is that many people fear uncertainty because they associate it with weakness, yet uncertainty can also be a form of honesty. It can be an acknowledgement that reality may be more complex than any simple explanation. It can be the willingness to admit that some questions remain unresolved. It can be the courage to keep searching rather than pretending the search is over. If you disagree with that, explain why in the comments, not because disagreement is a problem, but because honest disagreement often reveals more than agreement ever could. Some of the most valuable conversations happen when people stop trying to win and start trying to understand. And understanding becomes increasingly important when discussing subjects that touch the deepest parts of human experience. Because beneath every debate about God lies something even more universal, the human encounter with mortality. Every person reading this knows, somewhere in the background of consciousness, that life is finite. Most of the time that awareness stays hidden. Daily routines keep it quiet. Responsibilities keep it quiet. Entertainment keeps it quiet. But occasionally it returns. A funeral, a diagnosis, an accident, the passing of years, a glance in the mirror that reveals time moving faster than expected. Suddenly, the reality becomes impossible to ignore. Life is limited, and when human beings confront that reality, questions naturally emerge. Questions about meaning, purpose, legacy, love, suffering, existence. Questions that have followed humanity for thousands of years. The remarkable thing is not that people arrive at different answers. The remarkable thing is that people continue asking the questions at all. That persistence suggests something profound about human nature. We are meaning-seeking creatures. We search, we wonder, we interpret. We construct narratives that help us navigate uncertainty. Sometimes those narratives bring comfort. Sometimes they create conflict. Sometimes they evolve. Sometimes they collapse. But the search continues. It always continues. Which brings us back to the beginning. Watch this before you talk about God again. Not because it will tell you what to believe. Not because it will settle the debate. Not because it will eliminate uncertainty. It will not. The deeper lesson is something else entirely. The next time you enter one of those conversations, remember that you are not merely encountering an argument. You are encountering a human being, a person shaped by experiences you have not lived, losses you have not felt, hopes you have not carried, questions you have not wrestled with at 3 in the morning. Behind every certainty is a story. Behind every doubt is a story. Behind every conviction is a story. And once you begin seeing those stories, something changes. The conversation becomes less hostile, less arrogant, less shallow, more human, because perhaps the most important realization is not whether someone believes differently from you. It is that everyone is standing before the same mystery, trying to make sense of it from their own limited perspective. Some arrive with confidence, some arrive with doubt, some arrive with faith, some arrive with questions. But everyone arrives carrying the same fundamental condition of being human, and maybe that is the thought worth carrying into every future conversation. Not that certainty is impossible, not that truth does not matter, but that humility, curiosity, and self-awareness may be more valuable than we realize. Because the moment you recognize how much of the conversation is really about fear, hope, meaning, identity, suffering, and the search for purpose, you can never hear discussions about God the same way again. The debate remains. The mystery remains. The questions remain. But now there is something else present too. An awareness that the deepest subject in the room may never have been God alone. It may have been the human heart trying to understand its place in a universe vast enough to humble every certainty it has ever known.